My wife had just passed away when my father told me to marry another woman, just as he had done. This led to a conflict between us. I am a 26-year-old man who lost my wife, Annie, over a year ago when our two children were only 18 months and 4 years old. She was just 25. Annie and I had two young kids who were barely 18 months and 4 years old at the time. Almost the same age I was when I lost my mother. The similarity was haunting, forcing me to face the full cycle my life had taken. I was only 5 when my mother passed away. It's not just a single memory. It's a shadow that stretched over my entire childhood. Growing up, everything felt a little duller, a little emptier without her. The house was quieter, and my father was always busy trying to fill the void her absence left in every part of our lives. He did his best, but it was clear he was just as lost in grief as I was, even though he tried to hide it behind long work hours and forced smiles at dinner. I remember feeling constantly confused. Why my mother? Why our family? Friends would talk about their moms and their plans for Mother's Day, and it felt like I was living in a world where everyone else had something precious that I had lost. Birthdays and holidays were the hardest. Dad tried. But there is a particular kind of emptiness that comes from missing a person who should have been there for those moments. As I grew older, that confusion turned into a deep-seated fear of loss. I either clung too tightly to relationships or avoided them completely to escape the heartbreak. It wasn't until much later, in my adult relationships, that I began to understand the depth of my fear. Therapy helped. Talking about her, about the memories and pain, made it more bearable. Losing my mom at such a young age shaped who I am. It made me more empathetic toward others' pain and more aware of life's fragility. Back then, the world suddenly felt bigger and more intimidating without my mother. Even though I was too young to fully grasp how her absence would impact me, I felt it in every aspect of daily life. There was an emptiness at home, a silence that wasn't just about the lack of her voice, but about the missing layer of love and security she had provided. Annie had always spoken fondly of her father. She remembered how he would lift her high above his head, making her feel like she could touch the clouds. But she was just 6 when he was taken from her, swept away by a sudden illness none of us were prepared for. That loss left an aching void in her heart, shaping her in ways she rarely spoke about. She grew up determined to be the pillar her father couldn't be, to create a fortress of love for our kids, one that even death couldn't shake. But, as life often does, things didn't go as planned. It was a crisp fall morning like any other. Except Annie wasn't feeling well. At first, we thought it was just a minor illness, something that would pass. But it turned out to be much more serious. Within months, we were facing a harsh reality. Annie was diagnosed with a terminal illness, one that crept up silently but quickly took over. In her final months, Annie was determined to create lasting memories for our children. Despite her declining health, she spent every possible moment with them, reading stories, playing games, and holding them close, embedding her presence in their lives in ways she hoped would never fade. She often spoke to me at night, her voice a mix of determination and sorrow, expressing her need to leave behind a legacy of love. She wanted to be in their hearts and minds even when she could no longer be with them. Her biggest fear was repeating history, leaving our kids with the same hollow memories and unanswered questions that had haunted her. I watched as Annie poured everything she had into making sure our children felt her love. She recorded videos, left notes in unexpected places, and created traditions that could carry on without her. Her creativity in weaving these connections was both beautiful and heartbreaking. When she passed, the loss was immense, echoing the emptiness of her own childhood, but also filled with the love she had so carefully left behind. Annie had always been clear about how she wanted her funeral. It was something we had talked about in those rare, serious conversations that couples sometimes have. She wanted it to be a celebration of her life, not just mourning her death. "Don't make it all doom and gloom," she'd say with a smile, but she was serious about her wishes. "Make it a day where people remember the good times, with lots of flowers, and maybe even fireworks. When the day came, I was drowning in grief but also determined to honor her final wishes. The funeral was held on a bright, clear morning, almost offensively beautiful considering our loss, but somehow fitting. The church, chosen by Annie for its stunning stained glass windows, was filled with friends and family, all wearing bright colors instead of black, as she had requested. Wildflowers, her favorite, were everywhere in vibrant shades of blue, yellow, and red, turning the usually somber space into something full of life and love. Her favorite songs played in the background, a mix of classic rock and folk music, the soundtrack of our life together. After the service, we moved to a nearby park, another place Annie loved. There, the mood lifted as people shared stories about her quirks, her laugh, her energy. It felt like she was there with us, in the laughter and memories we carried forward. As the sun set, we prepared for the final tribute, fireworks. It was an unusual choice, but it was exactly what she had wanted. As the first burst of color lit up the sky, it felt like a release, a celebration of a soul too bright to ever truly fade. Each explosion of color reminded us of Annie's vibrant spirit, a perfect send-off for someone who had lived with such passion and love. Now, as I watch our children grow, I see Annie's influence in their resilience, their joy, and even in their sorrow. They talk about her often, recalling moments I hadn't even realized they remembered. It's clear that while death took Annie too soon, her efforts to be a constant, loving force in their lives were not in vain. She lives on through them, through the stories we share and the love we hold on to. As their father, my role has changed, not just to provide for them, but to ensure that Annie's love and dreams for them never fade. I see the same confusion and pain in their eyes that I once felt. They look for their mother in small moments, when they accomplish something, when they need comfort. I understand those feelings deeply because I've lived them myself. This shared experience has made me more patient, more attuned to their unspoken grief, and more committed to ensuring they never feel alone in it. We talk about Annie often, not as a painful absence, but as a guiding light in our lives. I strive to be the parent I needed when I was their age, to help them navigate this loss without feeling like they have to hide their pain. Seeing my children cope with their grief, I know the road ahead will be long, but I also see their resilience, and that gives me hope. While the pain of loss never fully disappears, it becomes part of who we are, making us stronger and more connected. I have promised myself to be there for them, to help them through this journey, and to ensure they always know they are loved, not just by me, but by their mother, whose love continues to surround them even in her absence. After my mother passed away, the house felt frozen in time, with fragments of her existence lingering in every corner. Her garments still hung untouched in the closet. Her books remained undisturbed on the shelves, and the air carried the faint trace of her familiar fragrance. This stillness, this carefully preserved world of hers, was abruptly shattered when my father announced his plans to remarry. It had been barely a year since we had lost her, and the news hit me like an unexpected tidal wave. Ellen moved in shortly after their wedding, bringing with her an array of boxes filled with new belongings, unfamiliar routines, and a presence that seemed to seep into the very spaces my mother had once occupied. Her attempts to rearrange the house, from shifting the furniture to replacing the drapes my mother had lovingly chosen, felt less like simple modifications and more like an erasure of the life we had built. Ellen was well-meaning, or at least she tried to be. She would prepare meals she believed I would appreciate and engage in polite conversation, attempting to bridge the chasm between us. But her gestures, no matter how thoughtful, felt intrusive, as if she were trying to weave herself into the fabric of a family portrait where she never quite belonged. My resistance wasn't rooted in resentment toward her as a person, but rather in a fierce loyalty to my mother's memory, a child's grief that clung stubbornly to the past. Tension began to brew at home. My reactions to Ellen's changes ranged from silent defiance to outright rebellion. I would discreetly return things to where my mother had left them, insist on using the same old dishes instead of the new ones Ellen had introduced, and steer clear of the remodeled spaces that no longer felt like home. I longed for the familiarity of my previous life, the reassurance of knowing that every corner held a trace of my mother's presence. My father, caught between his desire to move forward and my unwillingness to let go, grew increasingly frustrated. Arguments became more frequent. He accused me of being unreasonable, of not giving Ellen a fair chance. But from my perspective, he was erasing my mother's legacy, urging me to forget rather than remember. One particularly heated evening, my father's patience snapped after discovering me meticulously restoring the living room to its original arrangement. "We can't live in a museum," he shouted. "We have to move on. You have to move on." But how could I? My mother's essence lingered in every memory. The echoes of her laughter in the halls, the furniture she had chosen with care, the comforting scent that still clung to the house. It felt like a battleground, where each alteration to its old state was another painful reminder of how swiftly and mercilessly life could change. Ellen, caught in the crossfire, gradually retreated, withdrawing from her initial attempts to win me over. She found solace in her relationship with my father, while the chasm between him and me continued to widen. In those early months after Ellen moved in, the atmosphere in our home grew heavier. My grief remained raw, and I often sought comfort in old photographs and cherished keepsakes. My vulnerability was a stark reminder of the pain still festering in our home. But instead of offering comfort, my father's demeanor toward me shifted drastically. Whenever I broke down or openly mourned my mother, his reaction was not one of compassion but irritation. He would scold me, telling me to toughen up, to stop crying. It was clear he was struggling with his own sorrow, but his approach left me feeling abandoned in my grief. One night, he found me in my room, clutching a picture of my mother. His voice thundered through the silence. "Enough! You need to grow up and stop crying all the time. Life has to move on." His words, meant to push me toward resilience, instead felt like a dismissal of my pain. I looked up at him, my chest tight with emotion. "I miss her, Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Why can't you just let me miss her?" His next words landed like a cold slap across my face. "I'm happier now, and you should be too. I love Ellen more than I ever loved your mother." A suffocating silence followed, broken only by my quiet sobs. Those words, harsh and unfiltered, severed whatever fragile bond had remained between us. I felt not just the loss of my mother, but the creeping realization that I was losing my father as well. He had become a stranger, consumed by his own grief and newfound happiness, leaving me behind in the process. As the years passed, the emotional distance between us solidified. My father became increasingly absent, not just physically, but emotionally. My pleas for attention, for the affection I so desperately needed, went unanswered. His priorities had shifted, and I felt like an unwanted reminder of a past he wished to leave behind. Ellen, for all her efforts, could never mend the rift between us. It felt like a betrayal, not just of my mother's memory, but of the father-son connection we should have had. Feeling neglected and misunderstood, I withdrew into myself. The isolation at home drove me to seek solace elsewhere, in books, in school activities, in any place where I could find the warmth and recognition I lacked at home. But the scars of those formative years remained. I carried with me a deep-seated mistrust of relationships, a fear of being abandoned once again, of loving someone who might one day decide I wasn't worth staying for. As an adult, I can now recognize that my father was navigating his grief in his own flawed way, but that understanding does little to soothe the resentment and heartache of the child I once was. The child who felt discarded in the wake of his father's need to move on. Now, facing my own reality as a widower, I am determined to be the father to my children that I needed when I was their age. Present, supportive, unwavering in my love, no matter what life throws our way. After Annie's passing, my father reached out, hoping that I would now understand him better, that I would extend him some grace for his past actions. At the time, I was drowning in fresh grief and left his messages unanswered. Even now, the pain is raw, but therapy is helping me find some semblance of peace. He reached out a few more times, eventually apologizing for his initial message. A few days ago, we finally met at a quiet cafe, a neutral setting that seemed fitting for the difficult conversation ahead. As I sat across from him, my wedding ring still on my finger, a stark symbol of my ongoing sorrow, it didn't take long for the discussion to veer into uncomfortable territory. He noticed the ring almost immediately and took it as an opportunity to push his views on moving forward. "You can't keep living in the past," he said. "It's time to think about your future. Maybe start meeting people again." I clenched my jaw, irritation simmering beneath the surface. I asked him to drop it, but he persisted, perhaps believing he was doing me a favor. That's when he brought up his own past, his swift remarriage after my mother's death. He explained, with more clarity than ever before, how his new wife had brought him joy when he thought happiness was impossible. "I needed that," he said earnestly, "and I think you do too, especially for the kids. They need a mother figure." His words stung. It wasn't just a suggestion that I replace Annie, but the implication that my grief was indulgent, that I should set it aside for the sake of my children. I told him firmly, "It doesn't work that way. Grief isn't something you turn off to make space for someone new, and it doesn't operate on a convenient timeline." The frustration on his face mirrored the anger in mine, and as the conversation grew more heated, the weight of our unresolved past threatened to consume us once more. And I arrived at a delicate juncture in our discussion. His previous remarks about moving forward and discovering new love had driven me to my limit. The shock on his face was unmistakable when I countered his perspective on mourning and progressing. He hesitated, his expression genuinely perplexed. "How do you expect to find someone who will love you and the kids if you're still clinging to Annie?" he asked, his tone laced with both concern and a trace of exasperation. To him, it might have been a sincere inquiry, but to me, it felt like an indictment. "Annie was the love of my existence," I responded, my voice unwavering, each syllable imbued with undeniable truth. "And yes, I still hold on to her because love doesn't just evaporate when someone dies. You don't simply replace a person like that." I watched him attempt to digest my words, his gaze searching mine for something, perhaps a remnant of the son he once knew, unbroken by loss. I pressed on. "My children, they are my world, Dad. They are the other great loves of my life. But it's different. They rely on me, not just for love, but for protection, stability, and a sense of normalcy in a world that was torn apart." The hum of the cafe faded into insignificance as I leaned forward, ensuring he truly heard me. "It is my responsibility, my obligation, to provide them with the best life possible. That doesn't mean hastily filling a void with someone new. It means being present for them, entirely, without distractions or stand-ins for their mother." He was speechless, perhaps by the intensity of my conviction, or maybe by the stark realization that our philosophies on grief and love were fundamentally different. "But you need someone too," he finally murmured, almost to himself, a hint of sorrow threading his voice. "I needed my father when I lost my mother," I shot back, my words a fusion of anguish and defiance. "But instead, I got a man who moved on too quickly, who replaced her before I could even process my own grief. I won't do that to my kids. I refuse to make them feel as I did, secondary to someone else's happiness." We had reached the dregs of our coffees, cold, bitter, mirroring the atmosphere that had settled over our table. As my father prepared to impart another opinion on how I should navigate my life, I cut him off, years of pent-up frustration and pain rising to the surface. "I need to be clear," I said, my voice steady but resolute. "I will never, ever tell my children to simply move past their mother's death. I will not sit them down and tell them their mom is gone and that they need to accept someone new in her place. The cafe, usually a chorus of clinking cups and indistinct chatter, seemed to quiet around us. My father studied me, his expression hardening as he prepared to justify his own past choices. But I wasn't finished. And another thing, I continued, I will not chastise them for missing her, for crying out for her at night. They are children, and they lost their mother. How could I possibly dismiss that grief for the sake of someone else's discomfort? That's not what they need. They need a father who acknowledges their pain, not one who suppresses it. My father shifted uneasily, his gaze briefly dropping to the table before meeting mine again. "You think I don't understand that," he muttered, his voice a mix of defensiveness and fatigue. "I think you forgot when it mattered," I retorted, unable to keep the sharp edge from my tone. "You remarried so quickly. It felt like you were erasing Mom from our lives. You expected me to accept it, to be okay with the changes just because you were—" I leaned forward, ensuring my message was unambiguous. "I'm not searching for a replacement mother for them. What I am striving to be is the best father I can, given the cruel hand we've been dealt. I want to give them security, love, and understanding, not hurriedly fill a perceived void with the first person who comes along." I paused, my heart pounding with the weight of my admission. "And I will never, ever let them feel like they are second to anyone else in my life. The way you made me feel. You made it clear you loved your new wife more, and in doing so, I lost not just Mom, but you too." At last he spoke, murmuring something about regret. How he wished I could see things from his perspective, that maybe one day I'd understand. But as I walked away from that cafe, I recognized that understanding wasn't about merely seeing his point of view. It was about acknowledging the vast differences in how we process loss. I wasn't prepared to forgive the past simply because he had found contentment. My path was different, and I needed him to respect that without judgment or coercion. As I drove home, the weight of our fractured relationship sat heavier than ever. Some chasms, I realized, might be too expansive to mend, at least for now. In the ensuing weeks, he reached out a few times, texts, a handful of voicemails. His voice carried that familiar mix of concern and hesitation, as though he wasn't sure how to express himself without rekindling the flames of our last argument. Every attempt to bridge the divide only highlighted how vast it had become. I wasn't ready to cross it. My responses dwindled brief, impersonal, until eventually I stopped answering altogether. The silence wasn't comforting, but it felt necessary. Life continued, filled with the relentless rhythms of single parenthood, soccer matches, school assignments, bedtime stories. Every smile and every tear from my children reinforced my promise to be their unwavering support. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, his words lingered in my mind. I questioned the severity of my responses, the rigidity of my stance. But each time I considered reaching out, I remembered the child I had been, the one who felt replaced, and I retreated, convinced I needed more time. Seasons changed, and so did my kids. They grew taller, their faces shedding the remnants of childhood. My father's attempts to reconnect faded into distant memories, like echoes of a past before Mom's death. One chilly evening, as I rummaged through the attic, my fingers brushed against an old photo album. Sitting in a worn, creaky chair, I flipped it open. Vibrant images greeted me, snapshots of my parents in their youth, beaming with unrestrained joy. Picnics, beach trips, quiet afternoons. A life before sorrow reshaped our world. I traced my fingers over their faces, lingering on my father's carefree smile. The contrast between then and now struck deep. I missed him, not just his presence, but the man he had been before grief consumed him. It dawned on me how much loss had transformed him, how it had stolen the man in those pictures and left behind someone I barely recognized. Sitting there, enveloped by relics of the past, I felt the weight of our estrangement. Perhaps there was room for reconciliation, a chance to rediscover the father I had once adored. Closing the album, I made a decision. I would reach out, not to relive old wounds, but to remember what had once been whole. The next morning, I drafted a message. Simple, open, let's talk when you're ready. I wasn't certain where it would lead, but it was a beginning, a tentative step toward understanding. And as I hit send, the silence that had become my companion felt just a little less heavy, tinged with the faint hope of something new.